Okay, so we're talking about the modal ontological argument. So I'm explaining this to my material science friend, and I thought this might be helpful for you. So basically, the modal ontological argument is based on two things. It is this is a modal axiom. There's a thing called S4 and S5. That's the two principles of the modal ontological argument. And S4 says if something is necessary, then it is necessarily the case. And if it's S5 says if something is necessarily possible, then it is necessarily it's if something is possible, then it is necessarily possible, if I remember correctly. But also it says if something is possibly necessary, then it is also necessarily the case. Now this is the axiom that the modal ontological argument is trying to base itself on. And the reason why it tries to make that argument is imagine what do we mean by something being necessary. The idea behind something being necessary is not that it's true in one possible world, but it's true in all possible worlds. So you could imagine how there's possible world 1, possible world 2, and possible world 3, and ad infinitum. These are all the possible worlds. If something is possible, what means for something to be possible, or in some words contingent, is for something to be true in this, true in at least one of these, but false in at least one of them. So it has to be true in one or false in another. If it's false in all possible worlds, then that would be necessarily false. It's a contradiction. However, if something is, what we mean by something being true is that it's true in all possible worlds. So it has to be true in all possible worlds. So that means it's possible, and in these both mean it's either necessarily false or necessarily true. And what we're arguing is to say there is one property which exists which means that if it exists, it must be necessarily in all possible worlds. That's how, from this we get that. But also, by the definition of it being necessarily that, if it is possibly true in one possible world, then it must be true in every possible world, because since what it means by something being necessarily true is that in each single possible world it is true, if it's true in one possible world, then it follows that it must be true in all possible worlds. However, if it's not possible at all, then it means it would just be on this line. So when we're talking about the modal ontological argument, the only two options for a necessary being is either to be false in all possible worlds or true in all possible worlds. And therefore the argument is, since God is such a being of which its essence is necessary, it must therefore be true in all possible worlds. Now the only question is God a necessary being? That's one question. Is God a necessary being? Another question is that necessary being possible? And Leibniz would argue that the being is indeed possible because in order for something to be necessary, well, first of all, he has two arguments for that. First of all, he says, well, if something exists, it must have a necessary grounding. So somewhere down the line of explanations, you must have something to ground it. So in order for anything to exist, there must be a necessary grounding. Therefore, a necessary being, if anything was to exist, there must be something necessary. And since there are things which exist, then there must be a necessary thing. If it's even possible for anything to exist, then it also follows that a necessary being must exist behind that. And that's basically the modal ontological argument.
But how would you come about arguing that the existence of God is possible?
So then the question, and this is something Leibniz says, it's like, well, what would it mean for us to be able to demonstrate that God is a contradiction? Mm-hmm. And the question is to say, well, okay, it would mean that there's a certain element of God's properties which is contradictory with each other. And an example of that would be a classic one, is the omnipotence paradox, which is, can God create a stone so strong, great that he cannot lift? If it's something like that, then the argument would be something like along the lines of, well, all right, God is X, like God is omnipotent, but omnipotence is itself an internally incoherent concept. Therefore, God is impossible. So, and then that would be kind of a good response to this modal ontological argument, because you would just deny the fact that it's even possible for God to exist. Now, the response to perhaps omnipotence paradox would be to say, well, what we talk about necessary and possibilities, we're talking about that in a logically coherent concept. So, for example, you wouldn't say it's impossible for God's omnipotence to create a square circle, because that's just logically impossible. So the idea of logical possibility is kind of what he can do is limited to the realm of possibilities. And in that sense, you would then say, okay, well, that's one apparent contradiction or alleged contradiction, which just does not apply to God. And then another argument might be, well, okay, well, okay, let's try to figure out other properties which may be inconsistent with each other. And this is where I think Leibniz provides a very good argument, and where he says as well, okay, let's look at God's properties. He says, okay, let's just say God has a few properties, maybe A, B, and C. These are God's properties. For something to be a property of God, this is what Leibniz argues in his works. He says, well, all right, each of these properties, when we're talking about God, have to be absolutely simple and unanalyzable, in the sense that when we're thinking about power, we can talk about it in a sense of scale. But when we talk about something like God's power, that concept is unanalyzable because it's infinite. We cannot conceptualize it. But it's also at the same time simple because we're not thinking about infinity as a number on, okay, a real number or a natural number from 1 to like 10 or like 500 power. It's just a simple concept of God's power. The same goes to God's maybe omnipotence or God's wisdom and so forth for all of God's properties. And what Leibniz then says is, well, since all of these are simple and unanalyzable, it is by definition impossible to be contradictory to each other. Because if you have things which are unanalyzable, you cannot analyze them to be in contradiction with each other, at least within our own rationality. And if they're all simple, that means then they cannot be in contradiction with each other because they're the basic kind of fundamental aspect of reality. So as a result, they cannot be in contradiction with each other, which would then support the thesis that it is possible for such a being to exist. And one can object to that to say, well, all right, but still, even though it seems from your definition that it's still possible, one can say, well, okay, we still don't have proof that it's possible, to which Leibniz would just say, when we're thinking about possible worlds, we should give a benefit of the doubt to think that things are possible instead of not. Just because it just seems...
Because the burden is for you to disprove it rather than...
Well, partially that, although someone would argue that that might lead to a shift in the burden of proof, which is not something we want to do. But rather that when we're thinking about possible worlds, the confines of possible worlds is quite a broad one. Like, what do we mean by another possible world? And therefore, since it seems vaguely possible in our mind, it probably is a possible world, and therefore we can say that God is necessary in all of them.
Fair enough.
And that is the modal ontological argument explained.
Thank you very much.
Does it make sense though? I don't know. Like,